All right. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Carl and Lily and Alice from ATJ.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for being here tonight. So this is the fourth and final presentation in our 2024 Summer CLE series. And tonight we're going to be talking about language accessibility at the polls. And we have two very special guests, Lily True and Alice Yee from Asian Texans for Justice. Really excited and honored to have them join us tonight and work with us on this presentation. So let's dive in. I'm gonna share my screen. So give me just a second to get that set up and we will get started. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. All right, so like I said, tonight our presentation is on language accessibility at the polls. And just a little slide I threw together, just kind of welcoming everybody here tonight. So first off, for anybody who doesn't know, give you a little bit of a rundown of TCRP, the Texas Civil Rights Project. We are TCRP. We're a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization founded back in 1990. We have three programs in our organization. We have a Beyond Borders program that deals with border and immigration issues. We have a criminal and justice team that deals with criminal justice reform. And then finally, my team, the voting rights team. And voting rights team, we advocate for Texas voters through every step of the voting process. And so we always like to start all of our presentations with a roadmap that just kind of goes through what topics we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm going to be talking about the first three. We're going to start with talking about the demographics of language and the number of non-English speakers in the United States. We're going to narrow our focus down to here in Texas. And then once we kind of narrow our focus down, we're going to move into federal law that deals with language accessibility at the polls. All right, so let's get started. You're going to hear me a lot just in this entire section. You're going to hear me talk about the Census Bureau, the census itself, and something called the American Community Surveys a lot. When we get to the federal law section, you'll kind of see how important the Census Bureau is to this field. But just know that a lot of the information, almost all of the information on this demographic section is going to come from the census itself, and then also the annual American Community Surveys that the Census Bureau does every year. So just to start, I kind of try and tell a story with each one of these presentations. And when I got to writing this presentation, I had a hard time figuring out where to start. There's so much information out there about language diversity and the demographics of language in the United States. But when I was reading one of the American Community Surveys, I actually stumbled across a chart that shows the information that's on the screen right now. And I just thought, that's what we're going to do. We're going to start at the national level. We're going to narrow that focus down to how many of our fellow Texans need access to need this language accessibility at the polls. So to get started, back in 1980, so 44 years ago, the number of people in the US who spoke a language other than English at home was approximately 23.1 million. Now, at the time, that was about 10% of the US population. In 2019, so just a few years ago, that number had tripled to almost 67.8 million people. So now that makes up about 20% of the US population. So as you can see, that number, and this is 5 years ago, so that number is almost certainly increased as well. So one of the things I want to point out, you'll see approximately or estimates a lot. It's virtually impossible to get an exact number in this field. You know, it's kind of impossible to tell exactly how many people speak Spanish in the US or exactly how many people speak Chinese or Vietnamese. So you're going to see a lot of estimates and you're going to see a lot of approximates in this section. So what are the most frequently spoken languages other than English in US homes? So probably not surprising, Spanish is by far the #1 language. It makes up about 62% of the LOTE, or language other than English, population, followed by Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Arabic. And keep those 5 in mind because you will see them again when we get to the most commonly spoken languages in Texas as well. All right, so this chart, remember, we're kind of trying to narrow that down, our focus down from national down to the state level. So this is the percentage of households with limited English speakers by household language. And just so you know, the Census Bureau defines a limited English speaking household as any household that has no member 14 years old or older who speaks English very well. So you'll see at the top, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. Approximately 30% of households where those languages are spoken would be defined as limited English speaking households. Move a little bit farther down the list and you see Spanish and Arabic hovering around 20%. Move a little bit farther down, you see other AAPI languages. And then towards the bottom of that list, you see Tagalog, and that ranks about 8%. So that just kind of gives you an idea, excuse me, of, what percentage of these households may need language accessibility at the polls. All right, so now we can kind of start narrowing it down. Now that we have a little bit of a background in the national level, now we can kind of start narrowing our focus specifically to Texas. So this chart is a percentage, shows the percentage of the population 5 years and over who speak a language other than English at home. And just the key on the bottom, the darker the shade of blue, the higher that percentage. So in Texas, approximately 35.6% of our state's population over 5 years old speaks a language other than English at home. And that is second only to California, which is approximately 44.5%. However, importantly, I also wanted to note that approximately 36% of all Texans are bilingual in both English and another language as well. All right, so remember a couple of slides ago, I said keep Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, Arabic in mind. That's because those also happen to be the 5 most spoken languages other than English in Texas as well. So you'll see the order is a little bit different than it is at the national level. In Texas, Vietnamese is the second most popular, second most spoken language other than English. But you see those same languages pop up on the Texas list as well. And in case you're wondering, Hindi, Tagalog, Urdu, and French and German are actually they round out the top 10. All right, so the final slide in this demographic section. So we've gone from that initial number of about 67.8 million nationwide. So now we're trying to focus and figure out, since we're specifically talking about voting, we're gonna have to narrow our focus down to US citizens who are 18 years old or older. So the Census Bureau estimates that as of 2022, so just 2 years ago, there are at least 1.5 million US citizens 18 years or older in Texas who have what's called a limited English proficiency. And the federal government defines individuals as having a limited English proficiency when they, 1, do not speak English as their primary language, and 2, have a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. So now we kind of have our focus. So there are at least 1.5 million of our fellow Texans who are US citizens. They're 18 years or older. So that means that they would be eligible to vote, barring any other circumstances. They would be eligible to register to vote, who have that limited English proficiency. So again, at least 1.5 million of our fellow Texans. All right, so with that little bit of demographic background, let's dive into what federal laws are in place. And then we'll move down again to the state level and see what the Texas Election Code says about language accessibility. So at the federal level, language accessibility issues start at Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. That is the first place you would look. So let me just give you a brief little history of Section 203. So the Voting Rights Act itself was originally passed in 1965. In 1975, Section 203 was introduced as part of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. In 1981, the Census Bureau issued the first listing of Section 203 covered jurisdictions. And we're going to talk about what that means in a couple of slides. In 2006, Another reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act extended the language minority group provisions through the year 2032. And we'll talk about what constitutes a language minority group as well. And then finally, in 2021, so just 3 years ago, the Census Bureau issued their most recent listing of Section 203 covered jurisdictions. All right, so baseline question. What does Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act actually require? Again, remember, we've talked about how important the Census Bureau is to this process, and we'll show that more as we go through the next couple of slides. So I figured the best place to just find a succinct description of what the Section 203 requires would be how the Census Bureau itself views those requirements. So the Census Bureau says that Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act requires that covered states and political subdivisions, quote, provide language assistance during elections for certain language minority groups who are unable to speak or understand English very well and who have been excluded from the political process historically. So now we're going to go ahead and break this statement down into a few parts over these next few slides so we can kind of grasp the full scope of what 203 requires and who is covered under Section 203. So the first, what is a language minority group? So the terms language minorities or language minority group, you'll see them used interchangeably. But as they're defined in Section 203, language minorities or language minority group refer to persons who speak Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Spanish languages. And so I want to point out that Section 203 expanded the reach of the original text of the Voting Rights Act to include these language minority groups, while it also recognized that a history of educational discrimination led directly to higher rates of illiteracy among language minority groups, while also acknowledging that ongoing discrimination and intimidation were leading to lower voter registration and participation among language minority groups across the United States. So it looked at past discrimination and ongoing discrimination and intimidation and sought to remedy some of that past history while also acknowledging that some things were still going on that were leading to lower voter registration and participation among these language minority groups. All right, so let's move on to what jurisdictions are covered by Section 203. You know, we've said Section 203 coverage determinations a couple of times at this point. What does that mean? What does it mean to be covered by Section 203? So there's something called the Section 203 coverage formula, and that's how the Census Bureau determines which jurisdictions across the United States are covered under Section 203. So simply put, a jurisdiction is covered under Section 203 where the number of US citizens of voting age in a single language minority group within the jurisdiction, and there are a couple of different options here. One is more than 5% of all voting age citizens, or is more than 10,000 people within the jurisdiction. And the illiteracy rate of that language minority group is higher than the national illiteracy rate. So just to reiterate, if there are more than 5% of all voting age citizens in a jurisdiction who are members of a single language minority group, that can trigger Section 203 coverage. Or if there are more than 10,000 people within a jurisdiction, that can trigger Section 203 coverage as well. I do want to note though, there are three entire states that are covered under Section 203, all three for Spanish language. That would be California, Florida, and here in Texas. And an entire state can only be covered under Section 203 by meeting that 5% threshold. The 10,000 people within the jurisdiction threshold isn't considered enough to trigger Section 203 coverage for an entire state. A second thing to note here, after that 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the Census Bureau is required to update these coverage determinations every 5 years based on data that's collected in the most recent census. So that would be the 2020 census. And then those American community surveys that we talked about a few minutes ago. Previously, before this reauthorization, these coverage determinations were only updated every 10 years, in line with the once a decade census. So again, and as we're trying to narrow our scope, which jurisdictions in Texas are covered by Section 203? So these are the most recent Census Bureau determinations for Section 203 coverage in Texas. So as I mentioned before, the entire state of Texas is covered for Spanish. Dallas County is also covered for Vietnamese. Here in Harris County, where I live, we are covered for Chinese, which includes Taiwanese, and Vietnamese. Maverick and Polk County are covered for American Indian tribal languages. And then Tarrant County is also covered for Vietnamese as well. So coverage determinations are based on that coverage formula that we talked about on the last slide, and they can take place at the state, county, and all the way down to a city level. So just to give you an example of how that works, Massachusetts itself as a whole, it's not covered by Section 203, but the city of Boston is covered for Spanish language election materials. So another question that pops up, what elections are covered by Section 203? Short answer is all elections conducted within a covered jurisdiction are covered by Section 203. That includes primary elections, general elections, bond elections, referenda, and elections of each and every municipality, school district, or special purpose district within the covered jurisdiction. So every election that is conducted within a covered jurisdiction is going to be covered by Section 203 as well. So now we kind of get to the big question. What does language assistance mean? What type of language assistance has to be provided? Again, short answer is that all information that's provided to voters in English must also be provided in the covered minority language. So in Texas, that obviously means English and Spanish across the entire state. And in those 5 other counties that we mentioned a couple of slides ago, those additional covered minority languages as well. So a little bit longer answer, that means all ballots, whether it's a sample ballot, regular ballot, mail-in ballot, voter registration applications, and importantly, the instructions as well. Any place where you can find candidate qualifying information, how does a candidate actually get on the ballot? Any notices that are put up at polling places, any and all instructional forms and voter information pamphlets. And then also, very importantly, this assistance it can't take place just in written form. There has to also be an oral component to this. So assistance must also be provided orally, either by bilingual poll workers, trained personnel at a central location who can answer questions in the covered minority languages. We'll kind of circle back to that assistance, that last bullet point on bilingual election workers and trained personnel as we go through the state law section. So note here, it's the legal responsibility of the governmental authority conducting the election to prepare these materials and to make them available to voters. So who actually enforces Section 203? That's the Department of Justice. They have the following responsibilities regarding the enforcement of Section 203. First off, they are the ones who notify each jurisdiction that it's covered under Section 203 in the first place. Second, they provide information and answer questions about what are called compliance plans. This is particularly relevant when a jurisdiction first becomes covered under Section 203. They'll frequently file or compile something called a compliance plan, which is just that jurisdiction's plan on how to comply with Section 203's requirements. And then the DOJ also investigates and pursues alleged violations and take appropriate enforcement actions. And I want to note this for all of us attorneys on the call, coverage determinations themselves are absolutely exempt from judicial review. So if you are curious to see, the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ keeps an updated list of legal actions that they've brought for alleged violations of Section 203 at that link that's posted on the slide. And this isn't something that's gone away. In fact, the most recent Section 203 case brought by the DOJ was filed just this past May against the city of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So this is something that is being actively looked at by the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division. It's not something that's gone away with time. Okay, so that was section 203. So we can kind of see that that's really the basis for the requirement for bilingual materials. It has some real teeth to it. And, you know, like I said, the Department of Justice, it is something that still pops up frequently, unfortunately. But before we move to the Texas Election Code, I wanted to just note that there is one more VRA section that's extremely vital and crucial to language accessibility, and that's section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. And the entire section is 3 lines long. And it just says, quote, any voter who requires assistance to vote by reason of blindness, disability, or inability to read or write may be given assistance by a person of the voter's choice, other than the voter's employer or agent of that employer, or officer or agent of the voter's union. So if you were to look through that list of section 203 actions brought by the Department of Justice, you'll frequently see that section 208 or allegations of violations of section 208 are present in a lot of those actions as well. So why is section 208 so important? Because this covers interpreters. You know, some voters may need assistance having somebody interpret the ballot to them or interpret instructions or any of those election materials that we were talking about. And section 208 is the federal law that provides them the ability to have interpreters. So as we go into the Texas Election Code portion of this, you'll see that there is an analogous provision in the Texas Election Code that we're going to get to in just a few slides. All right, so leaving the federal law realm and again, narrowing our focus back down to Texas, what does the Texas Election Code say about language accessibility? So there are kind of 2 different categories that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about first, bilingual election materials. And you can kind of say that's analogous to section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. And then category 2 deals with interpreters and voter assistance. And that's analogous to section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. All right, so I'm not gonna. Don't worry, I won't bore you all to tears and read every single word on these slides. But this way, you have that information available if you want to look at it again after this presentation. But just to get the highlights and the points of these, that section 272.001 just says that bilingual election materials printed in English and Spanish shall be used in elections in the state. Section 272.004 says that those materials need to be available both during early voting and on election day. Next section talks about what those bilingual materials have to be. And we'll see, you know, very similar to the list on the federal level, instructional posters, ballots and ballot instructions, any official affidavits or other forms that voters may be required to sign in connection with voting, application forms for early voting ballots, any written instructions that are furnished to early voters, and then any balloting materials furnished to voters in connection with early voting by mail. So that's going to be the ballot itself, that's going to be the carrier envelope, that's going to be the instructions for how to actually fill out the carrier envelope and your mail-in ballot. All of those have to be provided in English and Spanish. So this page talks about bilingual election clerks. And in Texas, the Texas Election Code puts a preference or an emphasis on trying to get bilingual election clerks on the ground in polling locations. And if barring that, or if that's not feasible in a jurisdiction, if the number of election clerks who are bilingual is insufficient to serve the needs of Spanish-speaking voters in the election, the authority appointing election judges for that election shall appoint at least one clerk who is fluent in both English and Spanish to serve at a central location. Again, that just directly mirrors the language that we saw when we were talking about section 203. And then also, again, voter registration application forms have to be available in Spanish and English as well. So I want to take a second and point out all of these sections specifically mention English and Spanish. That's it. And yet we know from the previous section about section 203 coverage that multiple jurisdictions in Texas are covered by section 203 for languages other than Spanish. And that's where section 272.011 comes in. And you'll see it says, If the director of the census determines under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act that a political subdivision must provide election materials in a language other than English or Spanish, the political subdivision shall provide election materials in that language in the same manner in which the political subdivision would be required to provide materials in Spanish. So that again, you see citing the director of the census to Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, and this expands that to the other covered languages. However, I want to point out that this section of the election code was only added in 2011, despite multiple counties in Texas being covered by Section 203 for non-Spanish language for years prior to its passage. I think that kind of highlights the ongoing hostility and problems with language accessibility for Texas voters. And I also will say, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, but the last Section 203 case brought by the Justice Department against the jurisdiction in Texas took place in 2009. It was actually against Fort Bend County. And then just 2 years later, all of a sudden, this section was added to the election code. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. But it does show that for multiple election cycles after several jurisdictions in Texas were covered by Section 203 for non-Spanish languages, the Texas election code did not keep pace with the Voting Rights Act. All right, so now let's shift focus from bilingual election materials, or Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, over to interpreters and voter assistants. So this is the Texas Election Code's analog for Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. So first off, this is going to be in Section 61 of the Texas Election Code. So first provision says if a voter cannot communicate in English, an officer may communicate with the voter in a language that the voter and the officer understand. Second, and this is where we get to interpreters, if an election officer who attempts to communicate with a voter does not understand the language used by the voter may communicate through an interpreter selected by the voter, or if the voter has not selected an interpreter, an election officer may appoint. And then finally, we'll see who can serve as an interpreter. Again, we see any person other than the voter's employer, an agent of their employer, or an agent or officer of their labor union. This time we're going to move on to translating ballots. So if a voter cannot comprehend the language in which the ballot is printed, the voter may receive assistance. And I want to kind of note this one here, the Section 61.036. If an election officer and a voter communicate in a language other than English, any other election officer or poll watcher, and remember in Texas, poll watchers are by definition partisan, but any other election officer or poll watcher may request an English translation of anything communicated in the other language. And then if such a translation request is made, the election officer who actually communicated with the voter makes the translation. And so for the final slide, for my portion of the presentation, we're going to talk about voter assistance. Section 64.031. A voter is eligible to receive assistance in marking or reading the ballot if the voter cannot prepare or read the ballot because of either a physical disability that renders the voter unable to write or see, or, particularly important for our purposes here tonight, an inability to read the language in which the ballot is written. And then what does voter assistance actually mean? How is that defined? Assisting a voter includes but is not limited to the following conduct: reading the ballot to the voter, directing the voter to read the ballot, marking the voter's ballot, or directing the voter to mark the ballot. And with that, I'm very happy and very excited to hand the floor over to Lily True and Alice Yee from our wonderful friends over at the amazing organization Asian Texans for Justice. And Lily and Alice are going to talk about the work that their organization does and just the general importance, how important language accessibility really is. So with that, Lily, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Carl. And I just want to thank TCRP for inviting us today. to speak on such an important topic. And I want to share Carl's enthusiasm and reemphasize the importance of the census and the American Community Survey. And much of that work is also what we use to guide our work at Asian Texans for Justice. So hello, everybody. Asian Texans for Justice, we are a statewide 501c3, so nonpartisan nonprofit organization here in Texas. And we do serve the Pan-Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, community. Asian Texans for Justice is a relatively new organization. We've been around since just around 2021, but in Texas time, I think the last 3 years really feels like much longer. Our vision is a future in Texas where all people feel bold in their belonging, and the way we do that is by connecting Asian and Pacific Islander Texans to meaningful civic action to build personal and political power. So what that looks like for us is we really focus on 4 pillars of work. One is around policy advocacy, including issues like voting rights, but also issues like language access writ large, public education, immigration, and a slew of other areas. We also do quite a bit of work around youth leadership development, as well as coalition building. And then lastly, we do emphasize a lot of our efforts on voting and on civic engagement here in Texas, in particular on the AAPI community. And one thing I really just wanted to share and say out loud that often sometimes I think gets lost is I think people hear all the time that the Asian American community is the fastest growing racial group in Texas, which is true. But recently, in the last couple of months, the ACS, the American Community Survey, actually shared that between 2022 and 2023, the Asian American community in Texas grew faster than any other state in the country. So not only are we the fastest growing racial group in Texas, we're growing faster here in Texas than anywhere else. And I just share that to emphasize that all of those English proficiency gaps that Carl shared earlier, those gaps will only continue to widen as you see our populations shift. And so I just wanted to name that really quickly. And we can move on to the next slide. So just to get a sense of who we are, so my name is Lily True, like Carl said. I am one of the co-founders and I'm the executive director of Asian Texans for Justice. I am based in the Austin area. And just quickly, why this issue is near and dear to my heart. My parents were Vietnamese refugees, and so they belong in that community of Vietnamese native speakers who have historically struggled to participate in our democracy because of language accessibility. And Alice, I'll pass it to you to do a quick introduction.
Hi, and this is Alice Yi, and I'm one of the co-founder also, and right now is a senior strategy consultant for ATJ, and I came to United States over 43 years, and try to help our community with the civic engagement, with the language availability also, and that's it for introduction for right now, and I'll tell more data later.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. So we can move on to the next slide. Alice and I just wanted to spend a few minutes with all of you to really put into context what some of these things mean for community organizations like ours when it comes to language accessibility. So I want to just do a really quick case study with all of you around Section 203 in that Dallas-Fort Worth area. So the 2021 election year was the first year in which Dallas County was covered under Section 203 for the Vietnamese language. And so prior to that, Tarrant County had already established Section 203 coverage. And so as a community organization, we were really excited about the expansion. Unfortunately, just because it's covered doesn't mean that the community is informed of their rights. And so I think of my family, my parents, who are native Vietnamese speakers. Just because they now have the ability to vote in Vietnamese doesn't mean that they and their friends in their community know about it. And so we worked really quickly in 2021 and 2022 to try to fill the gap of what we believed was happening, where Dallas County was doing the language translations. They were creating these materials, whether it be the voter registration cards or the ballots or all of the different postings. They were doing the translation work, but the gap was that the community wasn't being informed that they now had this opportunity and they now were covered by federal law and had the right to vote in Vietnamese should they choose. And so some of the things that ATJ had to raise money as a nonprofit to invest in was to fill that gap. So different tactics that we took on were things like sending direct mailers to Vietnamese households in both counties, because we didn't want to just target the Dallas County area. We really wanted to be able to let both counties know, hey, if you want to come out in 2022 and vote in Vietnamese, you are able to do that. We also ran some in-language digital ads for folks to be able to engage and learn more about their rights. And then obviously, because as a nonprofit, we have limited funding and we have the limited ability to reach every single Vietnamese speaker. We did meet with local county election administrators to really encourage them to do that meaningful community outreach and also to do that work. Earlier, Carl mentioned having bilingual poll workers. Oftentimes in Texas, it is really hard to be able to recruit poll workers at all, let alone poll workers who are speaking the language that you're needing in that particular county. So meeting with those county election administrators to really encourage and push them to say, hey, you know, what can we do as a community organization to help make sure that, you know, the county is compliant with federal law, but also to ensure that we're doing our part in engaging the community, informing the community, recruiting poll workers, and doing what we can to get as many people out to vote as possible. And then lastly, exit polling is a large part of our work. And we do this to really help inform us of how well elections are being administered. And so in 2022, we actually did do specific exit polling at a Vietnamese community polling location in the area to speak directly to the community members to say, hey, how was your voting experience? Did you run into any issues, you know, completing your ballot? And so that's a lot of the work we did in 2022. And this year in 2024, we are continuing to do a little bit of that work. We do still believe that there is a gap to be filled. You know, these counties continue to be covered under Section 203. And it is a little bit unclear to us as a community organization as to how compliant these counties are being with federal regulations. And so one of the things that as a community organization we have to do is we have to constantly monitor and we have to constantly, you know, keep an eye out and keep checks on the county election administrators because we want to make sure that our community members are able to vote in every election and that they have the ability to vote in the language that is being protected in every election. So this is just a really quick case study of how we as a community responded when Section 203 did expand some coverage in the Texas area in this past couple of election cycles. And then we'll move on to the next slide. I'll pass it over to Alice to talk about some of the other protection work that ATJ is engaged in.
Yeah, and I want to add a couple of data on top of Carl's information. The total 2 million Asian American living in Texas, we have about 65% of Asian American adults speak other language than English at home. And for example, my dad and I living in our household, we speak Chinese. And also there's 32% of Asian American adults with a limited English profession in Texas. And as a voter, as an activist to help other voters, I really worried about the seniors who doesn't speak that much English, don't know how to apply absentee ballot. And if there's not too many people help them, so they will be locked out from voting. And also at a polling location, personally, when I went to Chinatown Center in Austin, Williamson County, in Austin area, and did expo survey, and there's a Vietnamese voter and the first time voter, and he doesn't speak any English, he has no experience to voting, and asked me to help him, and which I don't even understand him, so I have to call in somebody to speak Vietnamese on the phone with him to translate Vietnamese English and to help him vote. So this is where I was in front of the polling location and doing the expo survey. So I called it and I helped him. But I'm worried about other locations in case some people running into this situation. They really lack of help and have nobody to help him, and he couldn't vote because the whole polling location, everybody couldn't understand what he's trying to say. And all Travis County also has the issue, Travis County and Williamson County, the polling location election worker do not have so many Asian Americans or speak other language than English who works there. So the whole county, I know Travis County only have one Chinese speaking election judge. So this is all the numbers need to keep everybody's in mind. That's all I want to say. Sorry, it takes too much time.
No, Alice, do you want to talk a little bit about what's on this slide about the voter hotline and all of that?
Oh yeah, this voter hotline and from API Vote, which is our partner organization from national API, and we have all these different languages. In case I hope everybody, if who's a volunteer to working as at a pool or helping, and keep this number available. And in case you run into somebody, you can let them call this number. And we have volunteers nationwide to answer the phone calls to help them get to the right answer for them, or help them to speak to the election poll worker. And that's about it, right?
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Alice.
Yeah.
And I think with that, we'll pass it back to you, Carl.
Thank you so much. Alice, I did have one quick question before we jump to the Q&A session. If
Sure.
somebody wants to volunteer on either the API voter hotline or the Arabic voter hotline, who would they reach out to?
I can give you information. Yes, API Vote is the one coordinate all this voting hotlines. And I am the one of a volunteer to speak Mandarin on the other end, or Cantonese, or somebody, my friend speak Cantonese. And if any volunteer want to working for that, and contact us, and we can find the right place for you.
Yeah, and Carl, I just went ahead and dropped our email into the chat. It's info@asiantexansforjustice.org. For folks who want to volunteer, they're welcome to reach out and we can make that happen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and jump to question and answer session. If there are any questions in the chat, Veronica, do we have any questions in the chat right now? Or like Connie just did, just raise your hand. So Connie, what question do you have for us?
Do you have any, can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
we should. No, we can sure hear you.
Do you have any helpful advice? I mean, I've talked to the little old lady who's been working at the elections office for 35 years and just tells you, honey, we don't have any problems like that. I know everybody who votes here and we just don't have any of those problems. And how do you non-confrontationally and helpfully approach the workers like that? So that the voters we're working with can get the help that they need.
Lily and Alice, I'd be really interested to hear y'all's thoughts on how to approach the election officials in that capacity.
Yeah, I think this is it's a sign of a broader issue, to be totally honest, right? I think you know, with how quickly the population is changing and growing here in Texas, I think for someone to say, oh, I know all the voters, it's probably largely untrue in certain areas of the state. And I think what's really important is, I think, one, working with community groups early. So, you know, Asian Texans for Justice, we do a lot of county outreach early. We do a lot of outreach to folks that encourage them to sign up to be a poll worker. Oftentimes having diversity of poll workers is important. If you're a non-native English speaker and you walk into a polling location, you generally will feel safer and you feel more accepted if there's someone working there who looks like you. So working with community groups early, right, before early voting's begun is really important to diversify polling staffing. Exit polling is really important. Exit polling helps to ensure that folks, as they're coming out, are reporting maybe any abnormalities. And then all the voter protection work is really important, right? And making sure that folks know in advance that if there is an issue, they can call. Because if a poll worker is telling you, oh, there are no issues, to me, that's a sign that there probably are issues in that specific location.
Correct. And I do have that issue before. And they say that there's no issues and no problem, but at exit polling location, that's about back in 4 years ago. And actually, they do have issues. And this two young gentlemen and who couldn't find their voter file, and they're not belong to that, so they want to vote and couldn't find it, and they don't know what's wrong with it, and coming out rejected and coming out. So we figured out they not belong to Travis County, so they may be going to be Williamson County. So we found out their polling location is Williamson County, so we helped them. But at that polling location and Laura Mountain Elementary School that time, I remember clearly, and the polling location, the poll worker did not help them and didn't see the problem.
Oh, thank you, Alice. Connie, did that answer your question? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. About helping a voter at the poll. And earlier you said that you have to be partisan, or you can be partisan. I was confused.
No, that's quite all right. Yeah.
Uh,
No, if you're assisting a voter at the poll, you can't try and convince a voter to vote one way or the other, that the way that you want them to. What
yeah.
I was referencing is poll watchers. If there's an election official and a voter who communicate with each other in a non-English language, if there is a poll watcher who's at that polling location, they can ask for an English translation of whatever communication was had between the election officer and the voter. And I mentioned partisan because poll watchers are appointed by candidates on the ballot or a political party. But no, if you're assisting a voter, you have to, not try and influence them. You can't try and influence them or tell them how to vote. I just mentioned partisanship in relation to poll watchers.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about the confusion. That's totally on my end. I apologize.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Veronica, I saw a couple of chat comments popped up. Do we have any other questions in the chat?
Yes. So it looks like Taylor had a comment about being curious about the guidelines around Indigenous languages in the counties where that's required. Since there are so many, is there a system to determine which language materials will be available in? So for local tribal populations, reservations, etc.
Yeah, Taylor. So when it comes to American Indian languages, it's the Census Bureau. There are a couple of counties like in Arizona, New Mexico, where you'll see Navajo specifically. But and then obviously Alaska Native languages, they have specific native languages in certain boroughs, which is what Alaska calls counties. But when it comes to most of the other counties, it's just that given this catch-all American Indian tribal languages, I would imagine that the process probably relies on that compliance plan that we mentioned previously, and that the county needs to work with the Department of Justice to determine which exact tribal language needs to have its election materials, the bilingual poll workers, or the worker at the central location. To be honest, it's a little bit difficult to parse exactly how that process is done, but I believe that it probably takes place through the use of those compliance plans that we talked about.
And looks like we have sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that makes a lot of sense. So thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Veronica, you were saying we had another comment in the chat.
Yes, we have another question from Amy is asking, is a voter who needs translation allowed to use a phone to call their preferred translator while voting?
No, because
No.
Yeah, electronic devices like phones you're not allowed to have them within 100 feet of a polling location. So Lily and Alice, if y'all have a different take,
yeah,
please share. But
a quick
I was gonna
answer.
say, oh yeah, I was gonna say our general advice would be to try and plan ahead if at all possible. If you know you're going to need a translator or an interpreter, to try and have them accompany you before you get to the polling location.
They need to come in to sign the affidavit before
Yes.
the poll judge. Yeah.
Yeah. So that prohibition on cell phones and electronic devices isn't waived in a case like that. All right. Do we have any other questions, either from in the chat or anybody wants to raise their hand?
So looks like Janet is asking whether we can send out the email contact for volunteering information. But that is all that we have in the chat at the moment.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. Well, we are planning on sending a packet out to everybody who's here tonight. Any of the resources that Lily and Alice share or that we share at TCRP, please feel free to share those with your friends, colleagues, anybody in your network. And then, yeah. All right. Well, if that's the last question, then one more slide to show y'all what all of us attorneys were waiting for. Here's the CLE credit information. There's the course number right there. You can also use that QR code. It'll take you straight to the MCLE credit site where you can enter the course information for this. And also, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, this is the 4th presentation we've done in our summer CLE series. We had a disability access at the polls presentation. Then we had a couple of presentations on the whole counting ballot process and recounts and audits. If you missed one of those and you want to see them, starting next Monday, we're going to be posting all 4 of these videos online. You can watch them on demand. And we got those video versions also accredited for CLE credit. So they're going to have new course numbers. So feel free to check those out, and again, share those with anybody you think might be interested. And then just as a massive thank you to Alice and Lily, I would also like to say thank you to our friends at the American Constitution Society and the Asian American Bar Association of Houston. They sponsored this event. They helped us get the word out. And Lily and Alice, thank you so much for being here. And then thank everybody who attended, and have a great night, everybody. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.